Hello, my name is Reva Bhalla, and I'm here with Rodger Baker for this week's agenda. Rodger, Chinese Prime Minister Wen Jiabao wrapped up a 6-day tour to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE today. From my understanding, Chinese leaders don't usually make big trips to this part of the region. So what do you think framed Beijing's decision to make the Arabian Peninsula the focal point of the Chinese leadership's first major overseas trip?
I think there are a couple of aspects that we see at play here. Number one is energy security. The Chinese oil consumption continues to rise. They can't produce nearly as much at home. Their imports are much larger now than their domestic production, and they're always looking for ways to solidify that. Another aspect is economic. We've seen the Chinese oil companies, the Chinese construction companies really try to expand their activities overseas to draw in more currency, to keep people employed, and the Arabian Peninsula is a great place for more projects of that sort. I think there's a final little bit to it, and that really is looking at China's overall views of the world. The Chinese are here to see what's going on in the region after the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq.
And that creates a very interesting dynamic right now because this visit was taking place while the U.S. is making a much more concerted effort to intensify its sanctions campaign against Iran. And of course, China is a big player in that, considering that China gets about 10% of its crude from Iran. Now, the mainstream media has really been painting Wen's visit as the U.S. prodding China to have Saudi Arabia replace Iran in the crude exports that are going to China. But that narrative about Saudi Arabia being able to replace Iran that easily, with adding 2.5 million barrels per day or approximately that much, seems to be missing the point a bit. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't see the Chinese looking to really replace the Iranians as a source of oil. This is a country that, during criticism, continued to import Sudanese oil. This is a country that doesn't seem to be quite as concerned about these international issues. And from the Chinese point of view, they keep an eye on the South Koreans, they keep an eye on the Japanese, and so long as those U.S. allies are importing Iranian crude, they're not so worried about the sanctions and how strong the sanctions are going to hit. At the same time, we do see the Chinese looking to create redundant supply lines, looking to expand other suppliers. One of the problems with Iran has been that the minimal development of Iranian oil infrastructure over the past 5, 10, 20 years means that there's not much additional capacity. The Iranians can't export more. Well, the Chinese are always looking for more oil. Their consumption continues to grow. And so even if Saudi Arabia doesn't replace Iran, Saudi Arabia fills in some of those gaps of new oil demand that the Chinese have.
And we're certainly seeing more signs of Chinese infrastructure investment in this region. So I think a good example of that is the Abu Dhabi crude pipeline, which the GCC states are looking at as a model, perhaps, as they're trying to look for ways to circumvent the Strait of Hormuz. That pipeline is about 1.5 million barrels per day of capacity, which is a fraction of the approximately 10 million that's going through the strait every day. But it's a start. So perhaps we should start looking for signs of China investing more in those redundant infrastructural projects that the GCC states badly need to help insulate themselves against Iran.
Yeah, we would definitely expect to see more Chinese investment in those. The Chinese, in their overall energy strategy, are always looking to create redundant and alternative supply lines. They look at critical choke points, and they try to find ways around them. So we see what they're developing in Myanmar, that they're developing pipelines across Myanmar that move right up into southern China that avoids the Strait of Malacca, not for all of their oil imports, but for a piece of it. This pipeline is the first of what the Chinese would probably want to help with many pipelines so that there are alternatives to the Strait of Hormuz. And as we've seen the beginning of this year, the end of last year, the Iranians can make a lot of noise about potentially shutting down the strait. And whether they would do it or not may be a different question, but it's the risk that's posed that the Chinese have to work to mitigate.
And if you talk to the architects of the U.S. sanctions campaign, they emphasize a lot how they know they're not going to get an airtight sanctions campaign overall. But they feel that if they can wean off enough customers of Iranian oil, they can create a dynamic in which Iran is isolated enough to when it comes to the negotiating table with a big buyer like China, China can exploit that and start to charge higher and higher premiums, thereby cutting into Iran's bottom line. And in theory, at least, have Iran have less money to devote to military expenditures, the nuclear program, funding militant proxies, and so on. But that's the theory. How much leverage do you think China would actually have in a negotiation like this when we're already seeing price disputes come to the fore?
Well, in the current price dispute that we see, it's the Iranians who are trying to raise the price, the Chinese who are trying to lower the price. And in that, both sides have a fair amount of leverage. So China is the biggest consumer of Iranian oil, but Iran still makes up 10, 11, maybe 12%, depending upon what year of Chinese imports. So neither of them can really walk away from the relationship at this point. For the Chinese, it's still a question of, yeah, they want a better deal, and they may play a little bit, but they know that unless the Japanese and the South Koreans stop buying, that they're not going to have a huge amount of additional leverage, because it's very clear in those cases then that the U.S. is not going to strongly enforce sanctions.
And, there's so much emphasis right now on Saudi Arabia's spare capacity as being able to replace Iranian oil. And it seems that the Saudis are pretty uncomfortable having their spare capacity numbers in the spotlight right now. I think bottom line, the Saudis want to avoid a military confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz that is going to put their spare capacity in the global spotlight. That's not something they're comfortable with. So in that sense, I think that's where we need to look for signs of accommodation. We're already seeing signs of the United States reaching out to the Iranians, trying to open up a dialogue. Iran certainly caught everyone's attention with their recent military maneuvers in the Strait of Hormuz. And so that is another interesting dynamic here in which China is probably getting more politically involved in this region than ever before, whereas typically it's been primarily driven by economic interests.
Yeah, and the Chinese, this is a trend that's happening around the world. The Chinese have long had a policy that they don't get involved around the world. They're a non-interference policy. They don't meddle, or they don't strongly meddle as they would perceive it. But Chinese economic growth has placed Chinese interests around the world in a way that they can no longer avoid taking a stronger role. And you can see in the way in which this trip was carried out, it's by the Prime Minister. The Premier is primarily involved with economic policy. It's still the major tool that the Chinese have, which is economic. They have a limited ability to use military and political tools, but they're starting to expand their capabilities in those as well.
Well, given China's and Iran's simultaneous political rise, I guess it was only a matter of time before these major energy players started paying more attention to each other. And this is certainly a dynamic that Stratfor is going to be watching closely. That's a wrap for this week. Thank you for joining us for this week's agenda.